Welcome to the channel Sleepless History. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a dream. Not the kind you forget when you wake up or the kind where you show up to work in your pajamas. This one belonged to a man named Osman, a frontier chieftain from the wild, dusty edges of Anatolia, who at the turn of the 14th century fell asleep one night and saw the future. He dreamed of an empire. Now, before you get too impressed, remember, every ambitious warlord in history has had some kind of divine dream. It's practically a job requirement. But Osman's was different, or at least his descendants made very sure we believed it was. So if you're settling in under a blanket, maybe sipping tea or pretending to listen to a podcast while you drift off, this is the story of how one man's bedtime vision turned into 6 centuries of imperial drama, architectural wonders, and deeply questionable royal parenting. Let's take a slow walk back to Anatolia, around the year 1290. At this point in history, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which once ruled most of Anatolia, was basically running on fumes. The Mongols had stormed through earlier in the century, as they liked to do, and the Seljuks were now glorified middle managers for their Mongol overlords. The region was a chaotic quilt of small Turkish principalities called beyliks, each run by a local warlord with a mustache and a dream. Osman was one of them, the Bey of the Kayi tribe. His father, Ertugrul, supposedly served the Seljuks. But we can't say for sure because the sources are about as reliable as medieval gossip. What we do know is that Osman inherited a patch of land near Sut in northwestern Anatolia, which was basically the medieval version of living between two angry neighbors, the Byzantine Empire to the west and the decaying Seljuk realm to the east. It wasn't exactly prime real estate, but it did have one advantage: opportunity. Byzantine fortresses dotted the hills and trade routes snaked through the valleys. Raiding them was both profitable and spiritually fulfilling, since the Ghazi warriors, holy fighters, saw themselves as champions of Islam pushing into Christian lands. So Osman did what every ambitious frontier lord does. He turned raiding into an art form. Now, back to that dream, because every empire needs a good origin myth, preferably one with mystical trees and celestial symbolism. According to later Ottoman chroniclers, written about a century after Osman's death, which is always a great sign of accuracy, one night Osman was a guest of a sheikh named Sheikh Edebali. During his stay, Osman fell asleep and dreamed that a moon rose from the sheikh's chest and entered his own. Then a tree sprouted from Osman's navel, growing until its branches covered the entire world. Rivers flowed from its roots, nourishing fields and cities, and under its shade stood vast armies and towering domes, the symbols of empire. When Osman woke up and told Edebali, the sheikh smiled because, of course he did. He interpreted the dream as divine proof that Osman's descendants would rule a vast empire, and, naturally, that Osman should marry Edebali's daughter. Which, he did. Because when a dream conveniently says, marry this girl and start a world empire, you don't argue with it. The historical Osman was less of a philosopher king and more of a very determined warlord with good timing. The Byzantine Empire at this point was barely holding itself together. The capital, Constantinople, was technically under Byzantine control again after a short Latin intermission. Long story, involving crusaders getting lost and deciding to sack the place instead of Jerusalem. But the countryside, it was chaos. Osman started taking small towns and fortresses along the Byzantine frontier. He wasn't conquering in the grand sense yet, just slowly expanding his influence, collecting tribute, and making sure his Ghazi warriors got their fair share of loot. One of his earliest victories was at Baphius, around 1302, where his forces defeated a small Byzantine army. It wasn't a massive battle, but symbolically it mattered. It told the world, or at least the corner of the world that cared, that Osman and his tribe weren't just raiders anymore. They were here to stay. This victory also encouraged other warriors to join him. In a frontier world where loyalty was a flexible concept, Osman's banner started to look increasingly attractive. At this stage, There was no Ottoman Empire. There wasn't even an Ottoman state as we'd recognize it. Osman probably didn't have a treasury or a postal system or a central office for misplaced paperwork. His administration, if we can call it that, was personal and tribal. Loyalty was to the man, not to an institution. His followers were rewarded with land, spoils, and prestige. But here's where Osman did something smart, or maybe just lucky. He knew that if he wanted to build something lasting, he needed a sense of legitimacy. So he began adopting the Seljuk model of governance, using titles like Bey, minting coins in his name, and having the Friday sermon, the Kappa, recited in his honor. These were signals, subtle but important, that said, I'm not just a bandit, I'm a ruler. And that distinction made all the difference. Now, Osman wasn't exactly leaving behind detailed letters or philosophical writings. Most of what we know about him comes from later chroniclers, and they were clearly trying to make him sound like a saintly patriarch. He's described as humble, devout, generous, and just, which probably means he was pragmatic, occasionally ruthless, and had a great PR team after his death. His wife, Malhun Hutton, or maybe Bala Hutton, depending on which source you trust, gave him several sons, the most famous being Orhan, who would later take his father's modest frontier realm and turn it into a full-fledged state, with real cities, coins, and the first hints of royal bureaucracy. He was the first to call himself Sultan. And if Osman dreamed of empire, Orhan was the one who started building it, one fortress at a time. So when we last left off, Osman, the ambitious frontier chieftain with the world tree dream, had just wrapped up his life story, leaving behind a growing little realm and a son who was about to make it something more. That son was Orhan Ghazi. And if Osman was the dreamer, Orhan was the doer. He's the one who took the family business, raiding, conquering, and looking holy while doing it, and turned it into something that resembled an actual state. Well, a proto-state. It still had more horses than bureaucrats, but for the early 1300s, that's practically a modern government. So, dim the lights, breathe in, and imagine the rolling hills of northwestern Anatolia, dotted with tiny fortresses and slightly confused villagers trying to figure out which new ruler they should be loyal to this week. This is where Orhan begins his story. Orhan inherited leadership of the Kayi tribe around 1324, when his father Osman died. It's unclear whether there was an official coronation. Probably not. Medieval Anatolia didn't exactly have red carpets and orchestral fanfare, but he did have something more important: momentum. Osman had already set the stage with his early raids, and his warriors, the Ghazis, were fired up and loyal to the dynasty's cause. Orhan didn't need to reinvent the wheel. He just needed to keep it rolling, preferably over a few Byzantine fortresses. And that's exactly what he did. One of his first major moves was capturing Bursa in 1326, a city that would become the Ottomans' first real capital. It was strategically placed, wealthy, and, let's be honest, much nicer to live in than the dusty frontier villages they'd been calling home. Bursa was where the Ottomans went from a band of frontier raiders to an actual administration. It had baths, markets, and silk merchants who probably had no idea their quiet town was about to become the launchpad of an empire. Capturing Bursa wasn't just a military victory, it was a lifestyle choice. For the first time, the Ottoman leadership could settle down in a real city, with actual architecture, not tents. Orhan made it his capital, and more importantly, he started building. He commissioned mosques, madrasas, religious schools, and imarates, or public soup kitchens, the medieval version of social welfare. This wasn't just generosity, it was politics. Feeding the poor and building mosques made you look pious. It gave your rule moral weight. Also, it made your name sound good in the sermons. The Orhan Ghazi Mosque, which still stands today, became a symbol of that new order. simple, sturdy, and quietly confident. Orhan even minted coins in his own name, officially stepping out of his father's shadow. On those coins, he called himself Sultan of the Ghazis. Not king, not emperor. Sultan of holy warriors. Which is kind of like putting CEO of Destiny on your resume. Now, Orhan wasn't just a warrior. He was also pretty good at politics, or at least at marrying the right people. His most famous marriage was to Theodora Cantacuzenios, a Byzantine princess. Yes, you heard that right. The son of a man who built his career raiding Byzantines ended up marrying one. Theodora was the daughter of John VI Cantacuzenios, who later became Byzantine emperor. But at the time, he was just a very influential nobleman caught up in one of Constantinople's endless civil wars. To secure his position, John basically said, "You know what? I could use a Turkish ally." And Orhan, ever the pragmatist, said, "Sure, send her daughter over." It was a politically brilliant move. Marrying into Byzantine nobility gave Orhan legitimacy in the eyes of both Christians and Muslims. It also opened the door, quite literally, to Europe. Their alliance was sealed with Orhan's help in a civil war where he sent troops to fight on the Byzantine side. That's right, the Ottomans, future conquerors of Constantinople, once helped the Byzantines defend it. History has a sense of humor. That alliance had an interesting side effect. In 1352, Orhan's son Suleiman Pasha, not to be confused with the later Grand Vizier of the same name, Ottoman names are a mess, helped his Byzantine in-laws suppress a rebellion in Thrace. As payment, the Byzantines let the Ottomans garrison troops on Chimpe Fortress on the Gallipoli Peninsula. And that, dear listeners, was the first Ottoman foothold in Europe. It was small, just a fortress and a few surrounding villages, but it was symbolically huge. The Ottoman state, born in the hills of Anatolia, had officially crossed into another continent. They didn't even need to conquer it. They were invited in. You could say Europe basically opened the door and said, "Come on in, make yourself comfortable," which the Ottomans, being polite guests, eventually did, all the way to Vienna. Despite his military successes, Orhan wasn't a flashy man. Contemporary sources describe him as humble, calm, and kind, which in medieval politics made him basically an alien. He preferred simple clothing, ate with his soldiers, and often walked among his people without bodyguards. Either he was genuinely modest, or he just had incredible main character energy and wanted everyone to notice his humility. He delegated most administrative duties to trusted advisors, including his brother Aladin, who helped organize the early Ottoman institutions. According to later chroniclers, it was Aladin who suggested creating a standing army, the Janissaries, and standardizing Ottoman dress codes. Now, there's debate about when the Janissaries actually appeared. It might have been later, but the story fits the Ottoman tendency to retroactively invent origin myths. The point is, Orhan's reign saw the first flickers of the Ottoman state as we know it, a system, not just a family business. Of course, the problem with building something great is that people start fighting over who gets to inherit it. Orhan's sons were competitive, to put it mildly. His eldest, Suleiman Pasha, was a skilled commander, the same one who took Gallipoli, and looked set to succeed his father. But fate, as usual, had other plans. In 1357, Suleiman died after falling from his horse, a tragic, mundane accident that shifted Ottoman history. Without him, the line of succession became fuzzy. That left Murad, another of Orhan's sons, as the most likely heir. But since Ottoman succession wasn't strictly regulated yet, they hadn't invented the whole "let's kill our brothers to avoid civil war" policy. There was some tension. Still, when Orhan eventually passed away around 1362, Murad took over relatively smoothly. Well, as smoothly as Ottoman successions ever went. Orhan reigned for nearly 4 decades, an eternity by medieval standards. Under him, the Ottomans went from a regional power to a transcontinental force. He left behind a functioning capital, a growing economy, a loyal military, and a foothold in Europe. He also left behind a dynasty that was now officially addicted to expansion. From here on out, every sultan would feel that pressure, the ghost of Orhan whispering, "Go farther, take more, keep building the tree." And they did, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes disastrously. But Orhan's steady hand had set the tone, calm, pragmatic, quietly ambitious. The perfect ruler to bridge the gap between myth and empire. Let's drift forward now to his successor, Murad I, the man who would turn the Ottomans into a genuine imperial power, establish a bureaucracy, and, unfortunately for him, discover that being a conqueror often comes with sharp, pointy consequences. But that's a story for the next stretch of our quiet journey through Ottoman beginnings. So, when we last left off, the Ottoman project was doing pretty well for something that started as a glorified frontier startup. Osman had dreamed it, Orhan had built it, and now, stepping into the flickering torchlight, comes Murad I, the man who would take that modest little state and push it into full imperial adolescence. Murad wasn't born to be legendary. In fact, his name didn't even stand out much. Murad means wish or desire, which is poetic, but not exactly intimidating. Still, it fits, because Murad was about to fulfill every Ottoman wish that came before him and set in motion a few centuries' worth of royal migraines. So, let's float gently into his reign, around 1362, when the Ottomans were still more family business with horses than global empire. When Orhan Ghazi died, the transition of power wasn't automatic. The Ottomans didn't yet have a formal system of succession. No council, no official rules, and definitely no clear firstborn takes the throne policy. Basically, whoever had the most power, the best allies, and ideally the fewest living brothers, got the job. Murad managed to claim the throne relatively peacefully, which is honestly impressive given what would happen in later generations. His reign would last nearly 3 decades, from 1362 to 1389, and during that time the Ottoman state would grow into something that Europeans finally had to take seriously. The first order of business was to find a proper capital. Bursa had been great for Orhan, warm, cultured, close to trade routes, but Murad wanted something closer to his new frontier, Thrace, in Europe. So he took the city of Adrianople, modern-day Edirne, in 1369, and made it his new capital. It was a practical move. It also sent a message. The Ottomans weren't just visiting Europe anymore. They were moving in. Now, conquering is fun, but Murad also had to make sure his empire didn't collapse under its own weight. So he started formalizing things. Gently, quietly, like a man rearranging furniture without waking the neighbors. Under Murad, the first real Ottoman bureaucracy began to take shape. He divided his territory into provinces, called sanjaks, each governed by a bey. He created a central diwan, or council, to advise him, and he began the slow process of transforming the army from a tribal, horse-loving mob into something resembling a professional force. Part of that transformation was the creation, or at least the expansion, of the Janissary Corps. Now, this is where things get fuzzy. Historians love to argue about when the Janissaries actually started. Some say it was under Orhan, others under Murad, but Murad was the one who really institutionalized them. The Janissaries, from Yenicheri, new soldiers, were unique. They weren't Turkish tribal warriors, but slave soldiers, taken as children from Christian families in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and trained to be utterly loyal to the Sultan. It sounds harsh, and it was, but it created a corps of disciplined soldiers who owed their lives and careers directly to the ruler. No tribal loyalties, no noble families getting in the way, just men in uniform who answered to one person, the Sultan. It was genius. in a morally questionable kind of way. Murad's reign was basically one long road trip through the Balkans. He conquered Thrace, Macedonia, and parts of Bulgaria, moving steadily northwest like a man checking boxes on a shopping list. His generals took Philippopolis, Sofia, and Niš. Ottoman flags began appearing in places Europeans had assumed were safely Christian forever. And as they moved forward, Murad kept his operations organized. Conquered lands were often left under local rulers as long as they paid tribute. It was an efficient system, like a medieval version of a subscription service. You pay on time, we don't burn your city. Everyone's happy. But inevitably, Europe started to notice. The Balkan states, Serbs, Bulgarians, Hungarians, Wallachians, began nervously looking at each other and saying, "We should probably do something about this." Which, historically speaking, usually meant form a grand alliance, argue for 6 months, and lose anyway. By the 1370s, the Ottomans had become the region's new landlords. And not everyone was thrilled. In 1371, a coalition of Balkan nobles decided to push back. The result was the Battle of Maritsa, near modern-day Edirne. It did not go well for them. Murad's army, led by 2 of his commanders, ambushed the coalition at night. The European forces, confident, uncoordinated, and probably very tired, were routed. Most of the nobility drowned in the river. The Balkans, for the time being, were wide open. One by one, smaller states submitted as Ottoman vassals, agreeing to send troops and tribute rather than risk total destruction. Serbia, Bulgaria, and Wallachia all made uneasy peace deals. Murad wasn't trying to annihilate them. He just wanted stability. You could say he was the first Ottoman to realize that ruling an empire was more profitable than burning one. Now, what about Murad the man? He wasn't particularly glamorous. No famous love affairs, no palatial scandals, no artistic renaissance following him around. He was, by all accounts, a pious, restrained ruler, the kind of guy who would quietly pray before battle and then win it. He married at least one prominent wife, Gulchacek Hatun, and had several children, including Bayezid, who would become very famous for reasons involving horses and impatience. Murad also built things, mosques, schools, and charitable complexes. His building projects in Bursa and Edirne reflect a growing confidence. This was no longer a wandering tribe. This was a civilization in progress. His tombs, by the way, were elegant, but not overly extravagant. Ottoman sultans hadn't yet reached their gold-plated fountain phase. Of course, every long, successful reign eventually attracts drama. In the 1380s, the Balkans were once again in turmoil. The Ottoman push north alarmed the Serbian nobility, who decided to make one last grand stand. Thus came the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, one of those events that became so soaked in myth that separating fact from poetry is nearly impossible. The basics are this. Murad's army met a Serbian-led coalition under Prince Lazar on the field of Kosovo Polje. Both sides were large, both were determined, and both probably thought God was on their side. The battle itself was brutal but indecisive. Both armies suffered heavy losses, but what sealed it in legend was what happened afterward. According to Ottoman sources, Murad was inspecting the battlefield after the fighting, walking among the dead and praying, a nice image, if a bit convenient, when a Serbian knight named Miloš Obilić approached him. Now, depending on whose version you believe, Miloš was either pretending to defect, seeking an audience, or just sneaking in very bravely. Once close enough, he stabbed Murad, killing him instantly. The Ottomans killed Miloš on the spot, of course, and declared Murad a martyr. Serbian sources, on the other hand, tell it differently. They frame Miloš as a national hero, striking down the enemy sultan in the last act of defiance. Either way, Murad became the first Ottoman ruler to die in battle. and the only one ever to be killed by an assassin on the battlefield. His death was both symbolic and oddly fitting. He'd spent his life expanding the empire's borders. He died on the edge of them. Murad's body was buried twice, or rather, in two places. His organs were buried at the battlefield in Kosovo, because apparently that was a thing you did to show devotion, while his body was taken back to Bursa, where his tomb still stands. The Ottomans handled the transition efficiently. His son, Bayezid, later called the Thunderbolt, was quickly declared Sultan right there on the field. According to legend, he executed his own brother immediately to prevent a civil war. And thus began a new Ottoman tradition, royal fratricide, the medieval version of cleaning up the family tree. Murad's legacy was one of order, expansion, and quiet authority. He built the framework that his more flamboyant successors would later decorate, and sometimes nearly destroy. He left behind an empire stretching across 2 continents, with a standing army, a bureaucracy, and the firm belief that God had chosen them to rule. Not bad for a man who started as a provincial governor's son. Let's drift forward now to his heir, Bayezid I, known to history as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, a man who lived fast, ruled fiercely, and eventually learned what happens when lightning meets the Mongols. When we last left the Ottomans, Sultan Murad I had just been assassinated on the field of Kosovo, stabbed by a Serbian knight in one of history's more dramatic post-battle plot twists. And right there, amidst the chaos of corpses, banners, and clanking armor, his son Bayezid was crowned. No coronation robes, no golden throne, just dust, sweat, and urgency. Bayezid didn't have time for ceremony. His first act as sultan was, well, a bit of family management. He immediately executed his brother to prevent a civil war, because in Ottoman politics, better safe than sorry often meant better one dead relative than 10,000 dead soldiers. So, with that slightly grim beginning, Bayezid rode out from Kosovo in 1389 as the new sultan, and the world would soon call him Yildirim Bayezid, Bayezid the Thunderbolt. Not because he was fast on foot or had lightning powers or anything exciting like that, but because he moved quickly, militarily, diplomatically, and occasionally in the please slow down, we can't keep up sense. Bayezid's early reign was all about momentum. His father had built a foundation, and Bayezid's job was to cover it in marble and possibly a few heads on spikes. The first thing he did was consolidate. He secured the loyalty of the Balkan vassals his father had left behind. Serbia, Bosnia, Bulgaria, all were reminded that the Ottoman tax collector still expected a check even if the Sultan had changed. Then he went after Thessaly, Epirus, and bits of Bulgaria that hadn't yet gotten the memo. By the early 1990s, Bayezid had Ottoman control across most of the Balkans. His armies were efficient and, frankly, terrifyingly organized compared to the feudal levies of Europe. While the Balkan nobles were still arguing about who got to command the cavalry, the Ottomans were already packing up after victory and asking for directions to the next castle. Bayezid was a lot of things: bold, pious, efficient, but above all, intense. He had a kind of nervous, sleepless energy that later chroniclers tried to romanticize as divine zeal. In reality, he probably just couldn't sit still. He centralized power, tightening the Sultan's grip on administration. The provincial governors, beys, who had once been semi-independent, now found themselves carefully monitored. The janissaries became his personal instrument of authority. Bayezid wasn't much for delegation. If Murad had ruled like a wise shepherd, Bayezid ruled like a hawk on espresso. And then there were the Byzantines, still hanging on in Constantinople, by this point reduced to about the size of a modern city-state. Bayezid actually kept the same pattern of semi-friendly pressure that his father had used: siege them, starve them, negotiate, repeat. By 1391, he had the city surrounded. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel II Pelagios had little to offer except desperate letters to Western Europe begging for help. Bayezid Amin had a nice view of the walls and probably thought, one day, all this will be mine. He didn't quite get there. That would be left to his great-grandson Mehmet the Conqueror, but Bayezid certainly made sure Constantinople never forgot who was in charge. One of the more interesting footnotes of Bayezid's career was his marriage. He married Olivera Despina, the daughter of Prince Lazar of Serbia. Yes, the same Lazar whose forces had killed his father at Kosovo. Awkward family dinners, you'd think. But politics makes strange bedfellows. This marriage was part of a peace treaty, and Olivera moved into the Ottoman court, where she reportedly became one of Bayezid's favorite companions. It was a symbolic union, a reminder that the Ottoman strategy was not just conquest by sword, but also by marriage contract. Although, knowing Bayezid, he probably preferred the sword. By the late 1390s, Bayezid had expanded so far and so fast that Europe finally snapped awake. In 1396, a grand crusade was launched, the last real one of the Middle Ages, led by King Sigismund of Hungary, French knights, and assorted European nobles who thought this would be a good chance to reclaim some glory and loot. They marched into the Balkans, gleaming in armor, absolutely convinced they were going to teach the Ottomans a lesson. Unfortunately, the lesson ended up going the other way. At the Battle of Nicopolis, Bayezid utterly crushed them. The French knights charged uphill into well-positioned Ottoman lines, ignoring advice from their own allies, as French knights tended to do. The Janissaries calmly waited, let them tire themselves out, and then counterattacked. When it was over, thousands of crusaders were dead or captured, including a number of high-ranking nobles. Bayezid personally oversaw the aftermath, executing many of the prisoners, sparing others for ransom, and sending the rest home to spread the story of Ottoman invincibility. It worked. Europe was horrified, and the Ottomans were now the dominant power in southeastern Europe. After Nicopolis, Bayezid was unstoppable. He expanded deep into Anatolia, bringing independent Turkish beyliks back under Ottoman control, often with little patience for negotiation. He styled himself Sultan of Rum and ruler of 2 continents. He even dreamed of being crowned by the Caliph, uniting the Islamic world under Ottoman leadership. A little ambitious, sure, but in fairness, he had the resume for it. The empire stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. He'd created a machine of governance, taxation, and military discipline that was frighteningly modern for its time. And then, just when everything seemed secure, he met the one man on Earth who could move faster than the thunderbolt. If this were a movie, this is where the ominous music would start. In the east, another empire was on the rise, led by Timur, better known in the west as Tamerlane. A Mongol Turkic conqueror, Timur fancied himself the heir to Genghis Khan and didn't appreciate other Turkic rulers getting too big for their boots. He and Bayezid were bound to clash. They were too similar, proud, ambitious, and allergic to compromise. At first, their relationship was a polite exchange of letters. Then it turned into an exchange of insults. And, as was tradition, eventually into an exchange of armies. In 1402, Bayezid marched east with his army to confront Timur near Ankara. It was one of the largest battles of the era, 2 massive armies facing off in the dry Anatolian summer heat. And everything that could go wrong for Bayezid did. Timur's forces included war elephants. Yes, elephants, because why not? Many of Bayezid's troops were tired, thirsty, and demoralized. Some of the Anatolian beyliks he had conquered actually switched sides mid-battle, deciding Timur was the safer bet. The result was a total disaster. Bayezid's army was crushed, and the Sultan himself was captured alive. Now, there are many legends about what happened next. European chroniclers love to imagine Bayezid being kept in an iron cage, mocked by Timur, even forced to watch his wife serve at Timur's banquets. Ottoman sources downplay this, of course. They prefer to say Bayezid died honorably in captivity. The truth is probably somewhere in between. He was held under guard, treated with a mix of respect and humiliation, and died a few months later, in 1403, either from illness or despair. However you frame it, it was an incredible fall. One year he was ruler of 2 continents, the next a broken man in a foreign camp. Bayezid's death threw the Ottoman world into chaos. He had expanded the empire too fast and left no clear plan for what happened if he didn't come back. His sons immediately began fighting each other for control, the period known as the Ottoman Interregnum. It would take more than a decade before one of them, Mehmed I, finally pieced the state back together. Bayezid's reign, though short and intense, left deep marks. He had shown the world what the Ottomans could do, and also how fragile even the strongest empire could be when it moved too quickly. He built a system that would endure. He also reminded everyone, including future sultans, that empires can break just as fast as they rise. Let's float quietly now to that aftermath, the messy, brotherly civil war that nearly ended the Ottoman dream before it had truly begun. The candles are still burning low, the wind is rising over Anatolia, and a half-dozen ambitious princes are sharpening their swords. When Sultan Bayezid died in captivity in 1403, the Ottoman Empire didn't just lose a ruler. It lost its sense of direction. One day, it was the rising power of the Islamic world, feared from the Danube to Damascus. The next day, it was basically a family argument with borders. And like most family arguments, it started with inheritance. Bayezid had left several sons, all grown, all ambitious, and all convinced that they, specifically, were the chosen one. What followed was a decade of civil war that historians politely call the Ottoman Interregnum. So imagine 4 brothers, all with armies, all with advisors whispering in their ears, all claiming to be sultan. They sent envoys to each other, pretending to negotiate peace, while quietly building armies behind their tents. They declared truces, then broke them the next morning. It was like a medieval version of a group chat where everyone keeps leaving and rejoining just to cause drama. The empire was split cleanly in 2, Europe under Suleiman, Anatolia under Mehmed, with Musa occasionally barging in like, "Hey guys, remember me?" Let's start with Suleiman, because he's the easiest to picture. After years of war, he decided the best way to win hearts was through luxury. He styled himself like a Byzantine emperor, wore silk robes, held elaborate banquets, and surrounded himself with Greek courtiers. To the Ottomans back east, this was, suspicious. He was supposed to be the pious frontier warrior, not hosting poetry nights in Edirne with leftover crusaders. He also made deals with the Byzantines, Venetians, and even some Balkan princes, offering land and privileges in exchange for support. In other words, he was trying to be diplomatic. But in the Ottoman world of the early 1400s, diplomacy often looked a lot like weakness. So, of course, someone had to challenge him. Enter Musa Chalibi, the wild card of the family. He'd spent some time in captivity, some in exile, and all of it building up a personal grudge list longer than a tax register. In 1409, Mehmed sent Musa west across the Dardanelles to stir up trouble for Suleiman. It worked a little too well. Musa marched into the Balkans, declared himself co-sultan, and within a year had captured Edirne, killing Suleiman in the process. So now the map changed again. Musa controlled Europe and Mehmed controlled Anatolia, which meant, naturally, they immediately started fighting each other. He tried to centralize power and punish those who had supported Suleiman, especially the Byzantines. He besieged Constantinople, cut trade routes, and generally made himself unpopular with everyone within shouting distance. His paranoia grew, as did his reputation for unpredictability. There are accounts of him executing advisors on a whim and accusing allies of treachery mid-meal. It's the kind of leadership style that tends to shorten your resume dramatically. Eventually, everyone who had ever backed him, including the Byzantines and several Ottoman beys, quietly switched sides to Mehmed. And now we get to Mehmed Çelebi, the youngest son of Bayezid, and the one who, against all odds, would put the pieces back together. Unlike his brothers, Mehmed wasn't flashy. He didn't throw lavish parties or threaten to conquer Constantinople every Tuesday. He just worked. Slowly, methodically. He rebuilt local alliances in Anatolia, re-established control over rebellious provinces, and most importantly, kept his army loyal. By 1413, he was ready. He crossed into Europe, confronted Musa near Chamorlu, and defeated him. Musa was captured and executed, because that's how Ottoman arguments traditionally ended. And just like that, the interregnum was over. 10 years of civil war, betrayal, and exhaustion finally ended with Mehmed as the sole ruler. Now, Mehmed could have used this victory as an excuse for revenge. He didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath, metaphorically, and began rebuilding the state his father had left in ruins. He restored order to the tax system, reorganized the army, and repaired relations with neighboring states. He also re-established the capital at Edirne, symbolically linking the new empire with the legacy of Murad and Bayezid. His reign was relatively peaceful, which is saying something in Ottoman terms. He focused on stability, rebuilding the administration, reuniting Anatolia, and reminding everyone that the Ottomans were in fact still a functioning empire and not a particularly violent family drama. What makes Mehmed interesting is his restraint. He didn't try to expand too far or too fast. He avoided picking fights with Timur's successors. He left the Byzantines alone for now. It was as if he had learned from his father's downfall, that sometimes building an empire is less about thunder and more about balance. He reigned quietly until his death in 1421, earning the title the Restorer. His reign may not make for thrilling television, but it saved the Ottoman Empire from dissolving entirely. Without Mehmed I, there probably wouldn't have been a Mehmed II. You know, the one who eventually finished the job at Constantinople. By the time Mehmed died, the empire was once again functional. Its provinces were paying taxes, the janissaries were back in formation, and the Sultan's authority was no longer a family suggestion. His son Murad II took the throne, continuing the slow climb toward renewed greatness. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it worked. And in a way, that's the perfect metaphor for the Ottoman state itself, often at its strongest not when it was expanding, but when it was quietly repairing the damage left behind by expansion. Let's drift a little further now to the reign of Murad II, a man who spent half his life fighting Europeans and the other half trying to retire in peace, only to keep getting dragged back into wars by people who couldn't take a hint.
By the time Murad II came to the throne in 1421, the Ottoman Empire was alive again, but fragile. Thanks to Mehmed I's careful rebuilding, Anatolia and the Balkans were back under central control. The army was functional, the provinces paid taxes, and the bureaucracy hummed quietly, like a cat dozing in the sun. Murad, however, had no interest in the relentless sprint his grandfather and father had maintained. He preferred quiet, small pleasures, strolling in Edirne's gardens, reading poetry, and generally avoiding the sort of large-scale military campaigns that made his father Bayezid famous and dead. History, as usual, did not approve of sultans who liked naps. Murad inherited a state that needed attention but not immediate conquest. He focused on internal consolidation. Taxes were reorganized, provincial governors were reminded whose sultan they were working for, gently, of course, and with occasional hints that disobedience was not advisable. He repaired relationships with European neighbors, including the Byzantines and the Hungarians. Murad seemed perfectly content letting others squabble while he ensured that the Ottoman state didn't crumble from the inside. In other words, he wanted a long, quiet reign. Unfortunately, the Balkans are notoriously uncooperative. In 1422, some Serbian and Hungarian nobles decided that maybe now was a good time to reclaim territory lost to Bayezid and Mehmed I. Murad, not exactly a fan of ignoring rude neighbors, marched north. It wasn't a lightning campaign like Bayezid's, it was more measured, efficient. He reminded everyone that yes, the Ottomans still existed, and yes, they were still in charge. The Europeans were mostly compliant, which suited Murad just fine. He didn't want glory, he wanted stability. Here's where things get interesting. Murad, being cautious and probably tired of fighting, briefly abdicated in favor of his young son, Mehmed II's father, Murad's son, also named Murad. Actually, it was Murad II who tried a soft retirement and handed power to his young heir. This didn't go well. Civil unrest in the Balkans and Anatolia quickly reminded him that people like their rulers alive and present. Apparently, they don't trust nap-taking teenagers. So Murad returned to the throne. It's a pattern that would repeat itself in Ottoman history. Sultans discovering that stepping away from power is easier said than done. Murad liked to keep life simple. He had multiple wives, as was customary, but there's no record of scandalous intrigue that would shake the court. His children were educated, trained, and aware that one day the throne might pass to them, along with all of the headaches. He enjoyed poetry, music, and architecture. His building projects in Edirne included mosques, schools, and bridges. Not overly extravagant, just practical and pleasing to the eye, a reflection of his governance style. Murad's life seems calm, almost like he succeeded in being a ruler who wanted nothing more than to sip tea while keeping the empire intact. It's important to note that Murad never captured Constantinople. He spent much of his reign consolidating the Balkans and Anatolia, leaving the city as a Byzantine outpost. But he prepared the groundwork. Fortifications, supply routes, and vassal states were all strengthened, ensuring that when his grandson Mehmed II came along, the city would be vulnerable enough to take. Eventually. So, in a way, Murad was the quiet architect of future thunder. By 1451, the Ottoman Empire had recovered from decades of civil war, courtesy of Mehmed II's father, Murad II. Borders were secure, armies disciplined, and bureaucrats adequately terrified. Into this relatively calm empire stepped Mehmed II, a boy of just 19 years, already convinced that the empire could, should, and would be bigger. He was small, determined, and apparently lacked any sense of caution, a combination that would make him legendary, terrifying, and generally exhausting to contemporaries. Mehmed had been trained since childhood in the arts of war, administration, and languages. He was curious, intelligent, and impatient, and like many precocious teenagers, he wanted the world to move at his speed. Upon Murad II's death, Mehmed took the throne without incident. His first thought, apparently, this empire is fine, but Constantinople would be nicer under my control. The Byzantines, still clinging to their city like stubborn barnacles, were about to learn why ambition should not be underestimated in young rulers. Mehmed didn't rush blindly. He spent years preparing for the siege of Constantinople, carefully gathering resources, building a massive cannon, and organizing the logistics of an operation that would make any general sweat. He even built a shipyard on the Golden Horn, preparing to transport ships over land to bypass the chain that blocked access to the harbor. Yes, over land. Yes, ships. Yes, it was as exhausting as it sounds. Mehmed's artillery deserves a special mention. He commissioned Orban, a Hungarian cannon maker, to build the largest cannon anyone had ever seen. This massive piece of metal could fire huge stone balls that smashed walls like a toddler with a sledgehammer, but also required dozens of oxen, a team of engineers, and probably a fair amount of swearing. The Byzantines looked at the Ottoman preparations and probably wondered if surrendering quietly might have been a better option. In April 1453, Mehmed's army arrived outside Constantinople. The numbers are impressive, roughly 80,000 to 100,000 troops for the Ottomans, compared to a few thousand defenders, mostly Greek soldiers and volunteers. And the walls? Practically unbreachable under ordinary circumstances. But Mehmed was no ordinary commander. For 53 days, the city withstood bombardments, sallying forces, and clever Byzantine defenses. But Mehmed's persistence, combined with his massive cannon and naval innovations, eventually wore them down. He used tunnels, blockades, and feints to confuse the defenders, all while maintaining supply lines and troop morale, a delicate balance that made him a master strategist in the eyes of history. On May 29, 1453, the final assault was launched. The walls of Constantinople fell, Mehmed's forces poured in, and the city was officially under Ottoman control for the first time in over a millennium. The fall was devastating for the Byzantines, but historically, Mehmed treated much of the population with relative pragmatism. Many artisans and scholars were brought to Istanbul to contribute to the empire. Churches were converted into mosques, as was customary. Mehmed declared the city Istanbul, though the name would take decades to fully catch on. It was the end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of a new chapter for the Ottomans. Mehmed II wasn't just a conqueror. He was a statesman. He reorganized the administration of Constantinople, repopulated the city, and encouraged trade. He invited merchants, craftsmen, and scholars from all over the empire and beyond to settle there. He also continued campaigns in the Balkans, Anatolia, and even the Aegean Islands, demonstrating that once you had momentum, you didn't just sit around waiting for problems to appear. In other words, he was efficient, ruthless when necessary, and visionary, and completely exhausting to everyone who had to deal with him. Mehmed II's capture of Constantinople is one of history's most famous sieges, but it's his broader impact that makes him extraordinary. He transformed the Ottomans from a regional power into an imperial force with global ambitions. He centralized administration, restructured the military, and modernized the state. He inspired fear, respect, and occasional resentment across Europe and Asia, and importantly, he did it all before he was 30. The boy who wanted the city didn't just take it, he reshaped the destiny of an empire and set the stage for centuries of Ottoman rule. Let's start with the imperial harem, since that's usually the first thing people imagine when they hear Ottoman palace. No, it wasn't a romantic paradise of endless lounging and fruit platters. It was a political institution,
half domestic, half diplomatic, and fully exhausting. At its core, the harem was where the sultan's wives, concubines, and female relatives lived, governed by strict hierarchy. At the top stood the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, the real power in many reigns. Below her were favored consorts, then lesser concubines, servants, and tutors. It was a closed world with its own rules, alliances, and occasional accidents involving mysterious illnesses that conveniently solved succession disputes. Ottoman sultans weren't exactly free to choose partners based on romance. Marriages were tools of diplomacy. Concubines were chosen for beauty, intelligence, or family connections, and genuine affection was usually seen as a liability. Still, sometimes love slipped in, and when it did, it usually caused trouble. Take Suleiman the Magnificent and Hurrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana. She was a Ukrainian slave who somehow won the Sultan's heart, married him, which was not standard policy, and then influenced politics at the highest level. Under her watch, letters between the royal couple read like a mix of poetry and administrative memos. My moon and star, followed by, also, please execute that vizier. Romantic, in a bureaucratic way. But love wasn't the norm. Most sultans lived under a constant, heavy cloud of succession anxiety, because Ottoman tradition had a rule, unofficial but brutally consistent. Only one son could survive to inherit the throne. That meant brothers often became rivals from birth. The logic was simple. If you want to prevent civil war, eliminate the competition early. The emotional toll, of course, was catastrophic. Sultans raised sons knowing that when one became ruler, the rest would probably die by bowstring, quietly, at dawn. This grim system shaped Ottoman psychology for centuries, and it left marks. Some sultans cracked under the pressure, others retreated into isolation or superstition. Take Mustafa I, who spent years locked in the harem's cage, a gilded apartment designed to keep potential heirs alive but harmless. When he eventually became sultan, he was so overwhelmed that he reportedly spent his days feeding fish in the Polis pool, believing they were messengers from God. Or Ibrahim I, known, lovingly, as Ibrahim the Mad. He emerged from years of confinement to rule briefly, indulging in lavish spending, erratic behavior, and highly questionable decision-making that often involved furs and too much perfume. Eventually, his ministers decided that perhaps the empire didn't need another crisis, and his reign ended the way most problematic reigns did, quietly and permanently. Ironically, while male sultans sometimes lost their grip, the women of the harem often picked it up. During the Sultanate of Women, 16th to 17th centuries, several Valide sultans and royal consorts effectively ruled the empire. Figures like Kosem Sultan and Turhan Sultan acted as regents, negotiated treaties, appointed viziers, and kept the court running while their sons or grandsons were still too young or too unstable to govern. They controlled imperial finances, foreign policy, and sometimes even military appointments, all from behind screens and curtains. Historians used to dismiss them as manipulative or meddling. Now we recognize them as survivors in a system where power came wrapped in silk and suspicion. For most of its later centuries, the Ottoman palace resembled a world of half-waking dreamers. Endless corridors, faint music, whispers behind lattice windows, and the sound of scribes writing decrees by lamplight. Each room held the weight of centuries and the faint anxiety that one wrong word, one unlucky favor, could end a life. Servants moved like shadows, eunuchs maintained order, the Sultan, surrounded by luxury, lived in constant tension between divine authority and human fragility. The result was an empire that looked unshakable from the outside, but pulsed with quiet melancholy within. As centuries passed, the palace grew heavier with ritual and nostalgia. By the 18th century, sultans no longer led armies into battle. They ruled from gilded rooms, buried under layers of etiquette, titles, and poetry. Europe industrialized and colonized. The Ottomans debated court poetry and imported French clocks. It wasn't decay in the dramatic sense, more like the empire was falling asleep, softly, elegantly, without quite realizing it. The same empire that had begun with Osman's wild frontier dream was now a drowsy shadow of itself, too grand to collapse outright, too weary to change quickly. And yet, that's the charm of Ottoman history. It isn't just battles and treaties, it's people, flawed, brilliant, and tired, trying to balance duty with desire. From Osman's vision beneath a crescent moon to the women whispering behind palace screens, it's the same dream carried forward. To build something lasting even when the human heart wasn't built for permanence. It's a story of ambition, softened by sorrow, a lullaby of power and fragility that spans 6 centuries. So, as we close our eyes tonight, imagine the flicker of lanterns in Topkapi, the faint sound of the Bosporus outside, and the endless weight of history pressing gently against the quiet. Empires rise, empires fall, but they all end the same way, with someone closing their eyes just for a moment and dreaming it all back to life. As centuries passed, the palace grew heavier with ritual and nostalgia. By the 18th century, sultans no longer led armies into battle. They ruled from gilded rooms, buried under layers of etiquette, titles, and poetry. Europe industrialized and colonized. The Ottomans debated court poetry and imported French clocks. It wasn't decay in the dramatic sense, more like the empire was falling asleep, softly, elegantly, without quite realizing it. The same empire that had begun with Osman's wild frontier dream was now a drowsy shadow of itself, too grand to collapse outright, too weary to change quickly. And yet, that's the charm of Ottoman history. It isn't just battles and treaties, it's people, flawed, brilliant, and tired, trying to balance duty with desire. From Osman's vision beneath a crescent moon to the women whispering behind palace screens, it's the same dream carried forward, to build something lasting, even when the human heart wasn't built for permanence. It's a story of ambition softened by sorrow, a lullaby of power and fragility that spans 6 centuries. So, as we close our eyes tonight, imagine the flicker of lanterns in Topkapi, the faint sound of the Bosporus outside, and the endless weight of history pressing gently against the quiet. Empires rise, empires fall, but they all end the same way, with someone closing their eyes, just for a moment, and dreaming it all back to life. Every empire tells itself that it will last forever. None of them are wrong, just not in the way they think. The Ottomans live on not in power, but in influence. In the bridges of Bosnia, the mosques of Cairo, the music of the Balkans, and the kitchens of Anatolia, even in the quiet diplomacy and complicated borders of our modern world. Everywhere you look, the empire is both gone and present, like a ghost that never quite stopped walking. It's easy to romanticize empire, to speak of glory, of conquest, of golden ages. But if you listen closely to history, you hear something gentler underneath. Fatigue. The Ottomans, for all their grandeur, were human, endlessly human. They dreamed, feared, and loved like anyone else.
They built monuments that reached for heaven and then sat beneath them, wondering why heaven stayed silent. Every sultan, every vizier, every servant in top copy, all of them believed they were shaping eternity. And in a way they did, just not the kind they expected. Empires don't really die, they sleep. They fold themselves into memory, waiting to be dreamed again by new generations who find their stories too beautiful to abandon. That's what Osman's dream was. Not a prophecy of domination, but of endurance. That something born in a dusty corner of Anatolia could echo for centuries. That people could forget the names, but remember the feeling. And that feeling, the sense of belonging to something vast, tragic, and magnificent, still stirs hearts from Sarajevo to Damascus, from Skopje to Istanbul. If you ever walk through Istanbul at dusk, you'll see it. The city is suspended between worlds, between continents, between centuries. The Bosporus turns silver. The call to prayer rolls over the water like a sigh, and the domes of old mosques glow like sleeping giants, still guarding the dream of a man who once slept under a tree. The Ottoman Empire may be gone, but the story, the rhythm, the melancholy, the beauty remains. Because history isn't something that ends. It's something that whispers. And tonight, as the stars rise over the same lands that once called themselves Ottoman, that whisper sounds like a lullaby. A reminder that everything powerful is also fleeting, and everything fleeting, in the end, becomes eternal. By the late 15th century, the Ottoman Empire wasn't the fiery upstart anymore. It had become that empire, rich, self-confident, a little smug, and absolutely drowning in silk. The sultans now ruled from palaces with more fountains than sense. And instead of sleeping in campaign tents under the stars, like Osman or Orhan, they slept on embroidered pillows, under domes carved with verses about humility. The irony was not lost on history. When Topkapi Palace was built by Mehmed II, it wasn't just a home, it was a statement. A walled universe where the Sultan could command armies before breakfast, sip sherbet after lunch, and quietly worry about which of his sons would stab whom by nightfall. Topkapi wasn't about comfort. It was about control. Every corridor, every courtyard, every whisper was designed to remind everyone, including the Sultan, who held the world's most exhausting job. The harem, contrary to fantasy, was not some exotic pleasure den. It was a political minefield. Behind those carved lattice screens, alliances were formed, heirs were plotted, and careers ended with suspiciously poetic timing. Once the empire grew too big to run with just swords and prayer, the women of the palace began quietly taking the reins. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, often became the real power behind the throne. While her son attended ceremonies and signed edicts, she managed the court, balanced factions, and occasionally reassigned rivals to very quiet corners of the palace. During the 16th and 17th centuries, this era became known as the Sultanate of Women, not because women ruled officially, but because they mastered the art of ruling invisibly. One Valide Sultan might arrange a war to protect her son's legitimacy. Another might cancel it to keep the treasury solvent enough for more diamonds. It depended on the mood, really. Then came one of the empire's strangest traditions, the kafes, or cage. To prevent bloody succession wars, later sultans locked their potential heirs inside a guarded section of the palace where they were kept in comfort but isolation. Imagine living your entire life in luxury, with tutors, poets, musicians, and no door key. Some princes emerged sane and scholarly, others did not.
centuries of inbreeding and confinement created a few rulers whose hobbies included beating goldfish for hours and occasionally strangling advisors for breathing too loudly. But you have to admit, as far as dynastic safety measures go, it did reduce the civil wars, at the cost of everyone's mental health. By Suleiman the Magnificent's time, the Ottomans reached a kind of mythic perfection. Art, architecture, and law flourished. They built mosques that looked like they were drawn by angels with geometry degrees. Suleiman himself was brilliant, multilingual, and genuinely believed in justice. But his personal life? Oh, that was less poetic. He fell deeply in love with Hurrem Sultan, a former slave of Ruthenian origin, better known in Europe as Roxolana. She was witty, educated, and absolutely terrifying to anyone standing between her and the throne. Together, they broke centuries of custom. She married the Sultan, lived with him openly, and reshaped the politics of the court. It was romantic, political, and mildly disastrous all at once, which is exactly how empires usually prefer their love stories. After Suleiman, something shifted. The empire stopped expanding, not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. Centuries of conquest had given them land from Hungary to Yemen, but also bureaucracy, corruption, and too many cousins demanding pensions. The dream of Osman was still alive, but now it wore velvet slippers and carried a quill instead of a sword. The frontier Ghazis who once rode out chanting prayers of holy war were replaced by tax collectors in embroidered robes. The empire that had been built on motion began to slow down, and when empires slow down, they start to dream again. By the 17th century, the Ottoman court had become a maze of rituals, petitions, and ceremonial yawns. Each day began with a council meeting that solved nothing, followed by a banquet that solved slightly less. The Janissaries, once the elite backbone of the army, had turned into a union with muskets. They refused reforms, raised salaries by threatening coups, and occasionally rioted for better soup. Meanwhile, Europe was learning about things like telescopes and capitalism, two equally confusing inventions that the Ottomans greeted with dignified skepticism. The empire wasn't collapsing yet. It was decaying gracefully, like an old warrior wearing his medals to dinner. Still proud, still dangerous, but quietly aware the world was changing faster than his stories could keep up. And yet, through it all, the empire's soul, Osman's dream, didn't vanish. The sultans still believed they were chosen, that their crescent banners still carried divine weight. Even as the trade routes shifted and Europe's cannons grew louder, the Ottomans believed in destiny. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Because the empire that began as a campfire dream in a shepherd's tent lasted longer than most religions' reform movements. And when it finally ended in the 20th century, it left behind not ruins, but rhythm. A rhythm still alive in Istanbul's skyline, in the call to prayer that rolls over the Bosporus like breath over water.
It began not with thunder, but with laughter. A girl with copper hair and a sharp tongue entered the harem of the world's most powerful man and refused to be silent. Her name was Hurrem, the joyful one. To Europe, she'd be Roxolana, the mysterious red-haired sorceress who bewitched a sultan. But in truth, she was far more dangerous than a myth. When Suleiman the Magnificent met her, she was not like the others. While others bowed, she joked. While others whispered prayers, she sang. She looked at him, truly looked, and the ruler of half the world forgot his next decree. In a palace where obedience was oxygen, laughter was rebellion. And Hurrem laughed. She rose from a slave to the Sultan's confidant, then to his legal wife, a scandal that shattered centuries of Ottoman custom. No concubine had ever worn a wedding ring from a sultan before. Hurrem didn't just enter history, she rewrote it. Suleiman wasn't just a conqueror. He wrote love poetry under the pen name Muhibi, the lover. And his poems were not subtle. I am yours, you are mine,
"Together we are the world entire." These weren't lines of a warrior king, they were the confessions of a man undone by affection. He built her gardens, chambers, even fountains that whispered her name. But love inside a palace is never pure. It is scented with incense and politics. Hurrem's rise turned the court into a battlefield of whispers. She outmaneuvered rivals, including the powerful Mahidevran, mother of Suleiman's eldest son. Hurrem knew that survival in the harem wasn't about beauty, it was about strategy. She positioned allies, placed servants, and slowly became the beating heart of the empire's inner world. Letters show she advised Suleiman on diplomacy, trade, even war. When he marched across Europe, her messages followed him like a second command. And somewhere between orders and verses, affection became policy. But love in an empire always comes at a cost. Hurrem's influence led to one of the most haunting decisions in Ottoman history, the execution of Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's beloved son by Mahidevran. Mustafa was brave, popular, and dangerously admired. Rumors of rebellion reached the Sultan's ear, fed by jealous courtiers, and perhaps by Hurrem's quiet fear for her own children's future. In 1553, inside a war tent near Konya, Suleiman ordered his son strangled with a silken cord. The tent was silent, save for the flutter of banners in the wind. When it was done, the empire trembled. The poet king had killed his heir, and the world saw his greatness dim. Hurrem died first. Suleiman buried her in a tomb beside the Soleimaniye Mosque, a structure so vast it seemed to hold both heaven and grief. Years later, he ordered his own tomb beside hers, not behind, not above, but next to her. Even in death, he refused to be apart. Centuries have passed, and Topkapi's marble floors still echo with her laughter. Some say her ghost walks the courtyards at dusk, her veil stirring the jasmine. If it's true, then perhaps she's reminding history that empires rise and fall, but a single woman's wit can still bend a crown.
By the time Suleiman the Magnificent began to gray around the temples, his empire stretched from Hungary to Baghdad. But inside the walls of his palaces, the map of his family was less clear. Love had complicated the line of succession, as it always does when crowns are involved. He had many sons, as expected of a sultan, but only a few mattered in the deadly arithmetic of inheritance. And, thanks to palace politics, none of them slept soundly. After Prince Mustafa's execution, the empire's people never looked at Suleiman quite the same way. The poet king had killed the heir everyone loved, and the remaining princes, Mehmed, Selim, Bayezid, and Jihangir, lived in the echo of that silence. Prince Mehmed, Hurrem's eldest, was brilliant and ambitious. He was groomed for the throne, trained in law, poetry, and the art of not offending powerful viziers. He died young, possibly of smallpox, though some whispered that grief killed him, grief or a quiet dose of poison. Because in the Ottoman palace, natural causes often meant someone's plan worked perfectly. Jihangir, the youngest, was gentle and frail. He was born with a deformity that left him in constant pain. He adored his father, but couldn't bear the bloodshed that followed Mustafa's death. Not long after his brother's murder, Jihangir fell ill and never recovered. It's said he died of sorrow, which is the kind of explanation only royal historians can make sound official. That left Selim and Bayezid, two brothers raised in silk but destined for a cage match. Selim was soft-spoken, fond of wine and poetry, not exactly a soldier sultan. Bayezid was fiery, impulsive, and painfully aware that his mother Hurrem favored him. So, naturally, the empire divided its loyalties. The two princes governed provinces in Anatolia, close enough for rivalry, far enough for mischief. Their letters began as brotherly, then turned cautious, then venomous. Suleiman, now aging and weary of rebellion, tried to play peacemaker, but he was surrounded by advisors who knew a divided house was easier to manage. Eventually, the brothers' feud spilled into open conflict. In 1559, their armies clashed near Konya, the same soil where Mustafa had died years earlier. History has a way of circling back, like a hawk returning to a carcass. Selim's forces, with imperial support, crushed Bayezid's. Bayezid fled east, seeking refuge with the Persian Shah, who initially welcomed him, then betrayed him for a generous Ottoman bribe. Both Bayezid and his sons were executed. 5 bodies, 1 empire slightly quieter. And so the empire fell to Selim II, known to later generations as Selim the Sot. Yes, the Sultan of the world's largest empire, nicknamed after his drinking problem. Selim had little taste for war or politics. He preferred poetry, wine, and, reportedly, the company of witty courtiers who could make him forget he was running a superpower. He was the first Ottoman sultan who delegated almost everything to his viziers. Some historians say that under Selim, the empire began to drift. Not decline, just float lazily, like a ship whose captain is napping. Ironically, his delegation saved the empire for a while, because the viziers were very competent, and because, for once, the royal bloodline wasn't busy strangling each other. When Suleiman finally died in 1566, he was far from home, still on campaign, as if he couldn't imagine dying in bed. He was 71, still issuing decrees, still pretending he could outrun time. When his heart stopped in his tent, his body lay in silence for days while his death was kept secret. His generals didn't want to announce it until they secured the transition. Even in death, Suleiman was managing logistics. His tomb still stands beside Hurrem's, the poet and his queen, facing the same eternal skyline. Together, they had shaped not just an empire, but the pattern of Ottoman royalty itself, where love, blood, and fear were woven so tightly you couldn't separate them without tearing the whole tapestry. Selim's reign would mark the start of something quieter, stranger. An empire that no longer expanded like wildfire, but glowed like an ember in the dark. Still hot, still vast, but carried more by inertia than vision. People remembered Suleiman as Kanuni, the lawgiver, a man who ruled with justice, but also with heartbreaking contradictions. He built mosques that scraped the heavens, and he buried sons in silence. He loved deeply and killed decisively. He wrote poems that read like prayers and orders that read like nightmares. It's no wonder they called him magnificent. He was, in every direction. The world had changed. Suleiman's death left a palace that was quieter, yes, but somehow heavier. The banners still fluttered, the domes still glimmered, and the Bosporus still reflected the rising sun. But inside Topkapi, something had shifted. The empire that had once moved like a storm now moved like a sigh. Bureaucrats ran administration with efficiency, but also a sense of weary boredom. Janissaries still drilled, but sometimes argued over rations instead of strategy. And the royal family, well, they had perfected the art of doing very little while remaining frighteningly important. Selim II, known as Selim the Sot, wasn't incompetent. He was just selective in his exertions. He preferred wine and poetry over campaigns and decrees. He left state matters to his viziers, whose ambition often exceeded their caution. This delegation saved the empire from immediate collapse, but it also seeded the slow drift that would stretch centuries. The golden age of Suleiman became a faint echo, a soft reminder that perfection is always temporary. Even so, the people adored the palace rituals, the ceremonies, and the sense of order. From the outside, the Ottoman Empire still looked strong. From the inside, well, it looked like a palace slowly suffocating under its own grandeur. Inside the harem and court corridors, intrigues continued, though quieter than before. The princes, once locked in cages or plotting each other's demise, now became almost ornamental. Viziers, eunuchs, and palace ladies maneuvered in shadows, deciding policy, marriages, and appointments with deft precision. The empire became a delicate balance of appearances. A spilled cup, a whispered insult, or a poorly timed letter could shift the equilibrium. Every success, every treaty, every military campaign was now conducted by someone else's hand. The Sultan's hand, just occasionally. The empire's edges, the frontier lands where Osman dreamed of conquest, began to drift into chaos. Local lords, formally obedient to distant power, started bending the rules. Some rebelled outright, others negotiated quietly, selling loyalty for bribes, favors, or simply peace. Ottoman administrators traveled far and wide to enforce distant decrees, but the empire had grown too large. It stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Hungary, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, a map too wide to fold neatly. Even the soldiers felt it. Janissaries once drilled like a single heart beating. Now, some slept in ranks, others demanded promotions for trivial reasons, and many simply argued about soup. And yet, in this quiet, drifting world, the empire thrived in other ways. Architects, poets, and calligraphers continued their work. Mosques rose like celestial promises. Bridges spanned rivers with impossible grace. Scholars translated texts from Persian, Arabic, and Greek into Turkish. Coffee houses opened, and the first aroma of what Europeans would call coffee culture began to waft through the empire's cities. The empire decayed gently, like fruit left in sunlight, softening, ripening, but never truly rotting. From Osman's humble tent to Suleiman's towering mosques, the empire had followed a rhythm: dream, expand, consolidate, and slowly drift. Generations of sultans, concubines, viziers, and soldiers had added their strokes to a painting too vast for a single hand. And yet, even as the Ottoman dream softened, faded, or drifted into shadows, it left traces. In the streets of Istanbul, where domes and minarets still touch the sky. In the songs of the Balkans, where Ottoman melodies still linger. In the legal codes, poetry, and stories whispered in courtyards. The empire's heart, like Osman's original vision, refused to vanish completely. It rested quietly in memory, rhythm, and culture, a fading golden pulse that lasted far longer than anyone could have expected. Empires die, yes, but dreams, those sometimes outlive crowns, banners, and armies. And tonight, if you close your eyes and imagine a crescent rising in Anatolia, you can almost hear Osman's voice whisper across centuries. It was just a dream, and yet look how far it has traveled. The Ottoman Empire, from a shepherd's vision to a world-spanning realm, reminds us that history is never about walls or cannons alone. It is about ambition, love, sorrow, and the gentle persistence of human dreams. And so we arrive at the quiet, the stillness, after centuries of banners, battles, and whispered intrigues. Osman's dream began in a simple tent, where a shepherd imagined an empire stretching far beyond the Anatolian hills. It grew into the Ottoman Empire, vast, brilliant, terrifying, and occasionally absurd. It survived because of sultans who could dream, mothers who could manipulate, poets who could charm, and soldiers who could march through mud, blood, and snow. But empires are like people. They grow, they flourish, they stumble, and they eventually tire. The Ottomans didn't fall in a single battle, nor in a day of careless decisions. They faded slowly, gracefully, like the last rays of sunlight over the Bosporus. Walk along Istanbul's streets today, and you can almost hear the whispers of the past. Minarets cast shadows over markets where spices and textiles still mingle. The call to prayer drifts through alleys that once echoed with the clash of swords. In the quiet of Topkapi, the marble floors still hum with memory. Suleiman's mosques still scrape the sky. Harem's tomb glimmers in golden light. And the distant hills, where Osman once dreamed, hold the same wind, carrying stories across centuries. History, it seems, prefers patience. For all the grandeur, the flags, the cannonballs, and the bureaucracy, the Ottoman Empire was human first. A boy named Osman dreamed. A poet king loved. Sons fought. Mothers schemed. Soldiers marched. Artists painted. And philosophers wrote. It's easy to forget when looking at maps or reading annals that empires are made of people, with their laughter, their fear, their exhaustion, and sometimes their quiet brilliance. Osman's dream reminds us that a single vision, however humble, can ripple across centuries. So tonight, as you dim the lights and let your mind float over ancient hills and marble palaces, remember this: history is not just about kings and wars. It is about the dreams that survive, quietly, stubbornly, against the tides of time. The Ottoman Empire may no longer raise banners or command armies, but Osman's dream and the echoes of those who carried it forward still live. In the streets, the songs, the architecture, and in the quiet pulse of human ambition that whispers across generations. And with that, perhaps it's time to close your eyes, to drift through tents, palaces, and minarets, to float over empires rising and falling, and remember, even a dream that began in the simplest way can leave a mark that lasts far longer than a lifetime. Good night.